The cameras were rolling on what seemed like another typical Family Feud taping. But 59-year-old Thomas Mitchell sat at the contestant podium carrying a story so profound that when Steve Harvey finally uncovered it, he would break down completely and embrace this man in front of millions. What Thomas had been secretly doing for 3 years under a highway bridge would redefine everything everyone thought they knew about homelessness, education, and the true meaning of wealth. It was a Thursday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. Steve Harvey was in his element, that perfectly tailored navy suit catching the studio lights, his characteristic energy filling the room with warmth and laughter. The Mitchell family from Chicago was competing against the Rodriguez family from Miami, and everything was proceeding exactly as planned. But Thomas Mitchell wasn't really there for the game. He sat quietly at the edge of his family's podium, his clothes clean but clearly worn, his hands showing the calluses and dirt of someone who lived rough. His nephew David had brought him to the show, hoping that maybe being around family and laughter would help Thomas find his way back to himself. During the pre-show introductions, Steve immediately noticed something different about Thomas. While his family members were excited and animated, Thomas seemed to carry a weight that made him almost invisible, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. "So Thomas," Steve said during the family introductions, "tell me about yourself, man." Thomas looked up briefly, then back down. I'm between situations right now." "Between situations?" Steve's eyebrows raised slightly. His comedian instincts told him to make a light joke, but something about Thomas's demeanor stopped him. David, Thomas's nephew, stepped in quickly. "Uncle Thomas is just going through a rough patch. We're helping him get back on his feet." Steve nodded, but he caught the look that passed over Thomas's face. Shame, mixed with something else Steve couldn't quite identify. Pain, maybe, or regret. The game began normally enough. The Mitchell family was doing well, answering questions and celebrating small victories. But during the fourth round, when the category was things that make someone feel proud, everything changed. Steve announced the question, "Name something that might make a teacher proud." It was Thomas's turn, and he had been mostly silent throughout the game. But when Steve read that question, something shifted in Thomas's expression. His shoulders straightened slightly, and for the first time since the cameras started rolling, he looked directly at Steve. "When a student learns to read," Thomas said, his voice carrying a weight and certainty that surprised everyone. "When a student learns to read," Steve repeated, but he was studying Thomas's face carefully. The answer was specific, passionate, and came from someone who clearly understood the profound impact of literacy. "That's beautiful, man," survey says. The board revealed it was the #1 answer, but Thomas didn't celebrate. If anything, he looked like he was fighting back tears. Steve set down his cards and walked closer to the Mitchell family podium. "Thomas, that answer, that came from the heart. You sound like you know what it's like to see someone learn to read." Thomas looked up at Steve, and for the first time since the show began, his carefully maintained walls began to crack. I used to teach. A long time ago." "Used to teach what?" "Literature, Shakespeare, mostly. Dickens, the classics." The studio fell quieter. Steve's expression shifted from entertainer to counselor, as he sensed there was much more to this story. "What happened to your teaching career, Thomas?" That's when Thomas broke. 3 years of carrying shame, 3 years of his family seeing him as a failure, 3 years of living under a bridge while hiding the most important work of his life. All came crashing down in that moment. But what Steve discovered next would prove that sometimes the most important classrooms don't have walls. "My wife died," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely audible over the studio microphones. "Sarah, she was everything to me. When the cancer took her, I couldn't function anymore." Steve's hand moved into that protective gesture, palm forward, fingers extended, as he processed Thomas's word. "I stopped going to work," Thomas continued, the words coming faster now. "Stopped paying bills. Lost the house. Lost my job. Lost everything. My family tried to help, but I was so deep in grief that I couldn't accept it." Steve walked closer to Thomas. "Where are you living now, Thomas?" "Under the Highway 85 bridge," Thomas replied simply. "There's a little community there. About 40 people, maybe 50 on cold nights." The studio was completely silent now. The Rodriguez family had abandoned their competitive stance and were simply witnessing this moment of raw human honesty. "Thomas," Steve said gently, "what do you do all day? How do you get by?" That's when Thomas looked up at Steve with something approaching pride for the first time since the cameras started rolling. "I teach," he said. "You teach?" "Every morning at 7 a.m., under the bridge. Anyone who wants to learn. Reading, writing, basic math." Some of them never went to school. Some forgot how after years on the streets. Some are trying to fill out job applications or read medication labels. Steve's mouth opened slightly in that expression of amazement that had become his trademark. "You're running a school under a bridge?" "I prefer to think of it as a classroom without walls," Thomas replied, and for the first time there was a hint of the professor he used to be in his voice. But what happened next would reveal just how profound Thomas's hidden ministry really was. Steve made a decision that would change Thomas's life forever. He pulled out his cell phone right there on stage. "Thomas, I need to make a phone call, right now, because something tells me there are people who want to thank their teacher." The studio watched as Steve dialed a number he had quickly looked up during the commercial break. "Chicago City College," Steve said into his phone. "This is Steve Harvey from Family Feud. I need to speak with someone about a former professor, Thomas Mitchell." There was a pause, and then Steve's expression changed completely. "Yes, I'll hold," he said, then looked at Thomas. "Thomas, they remember you at the college. They're transferring me to the dean." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "They probably remember me leaving without notice. Abandoning my students." "Dr. Patricia Williams?" Steve said into the phone. "This is Steve Harvey. I'm here with Thomas Mitchell." "Yes, that Thomas Mitchell. Ma'am, he's telling me he's been living under a bridge and teaching homeless people to read." There was another pause, and then Steve put the call on speaker. "Professor Mitchell," came a woman's voice through the studio speakers. "Oh my God, Thomas, we've been looking for you for 3 years." Thomas stared at the phone in shock. "Dr. Williams." "Thomas, after you disappeared, we found out about Sarah. We understood completely why you couldn't continue. But what you don't know is that your students, they never stopped talking about you. You changed their lives." "I abandoned them," Thomas whispered. "No, Thomas. You taught them that literature isn't just about books. You taught them that stories have the power to help us understand loss and love and what it means to be human. Several of them have reached out over the years to tell us that your classes helped them through their own difficult times." The studio was riveted. Steve's hand remained in that protective gesture as he facilitated what was clearly a life-changing conversation. But Dr. Williams wasn't finished. "Thomas, what you're doing under that bridge, teaching people to read, that's exactly who you've always been. You're still Professor Mitchell. You're still changing lives. You're just doing it in a different classroom." That's when Steve Harvey did something unprecedented in his 40 years of television. Steve looked at Thomas, then at the phone, then made a decision that would honor not just Thomas but every educator who had ever worked without recognition or reward. "Dr. Williams," Steve said, "I want you to know that Professor Thomas Mitchell has been running what might be the most important school in America. No funding, no building, no recognition, just a man with knowledge sharing it with people who need it most." Steve hung up the phone and turned to face Thomas directly. "Thomas, stand up," Steve said, his voice carrying a gravity that transformed the entertainment space into something sacred. Thomas stood slowly, still processing what had just happened. Steve Harvey, in his perfectly tailored navy suit in front of hundreds of people and millions of viewers, slowly removed his jacket and draped it around Thomas's shoulders. "This jacket has been with me through thousands of shows," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. "But today it belongs with someone who understands what education really means, someone who proves that the most important teaching happens not when you have everything, but when you have nothing left to give except knowledge and hope." The applause that followed was unlike anything the Family Feud studio had ever heard. It wasn't game show applause, it was the sound of people recognizing something sacred. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced, "this is Professor Thomas Mitchell. For 3 years he has been teaching literacy to homeless men and women under a highway bridge in Chicago. No salary, no classroom, no recognition, just a man who lost everything but remembered that knowledge belongs to everyone." Steve turned back to Thomas. "Professor, how many students do you have in your bridge classroom?" Thomas wiped his eyes with the sleeve of Steve's expensive jacket. "About 60 regulars. Maybe 100 people have come through over the 3 years." "And how many have learned to read?" "Most of them. We've had 27 people get jobs because they could finally fill out applications. 15 people reconnected with family members because they could read letters. 3 people are now in GED." Steve's expression showed the profound impact of these numbers. "Thomas, you haven't been homeless for 3 years. You've been on a mission." The episode that aired months later became one of the most shared Family Feud moments in social media history. Not for its entertainment value, but because it redefined what success looks like. The Chicago Department of Social Services contacted Steve's production team before the episode even finished taping. They wanted to support Thomas's bridge school officially. Within weeks, they had provided weather-resistant materials, books, and even portable heaters for winter classes. Thomas never moved back into traditional housing. He chose to stay near his students in a small apartment close to the bridge, continuing his work as the professor under the bridge. The jacket Steve gave him hangs in what is now called the Mitchell Learning Center, a permanent structure built next to the highway bridge, funded by donations from viewers who were inspired by Thomas's story. Years later, Steve Harvey often tells interviewers that Thomas Mitchell taught him the difference between being successful and being significant. "Success is about what you achieve," Steve explains. "Significance is about what you give when you have nothing left to lose." Sometimes the most important schools don't have walls. Sometimes the greatest teachers are those who lost everything except their passion to share knowledge. And sometimes a man living under a bridge can teach a television studio full of people what wealth really means. Share this story. Because somewhere, there's another Thomas Mitchell using their gifts in unexpected places, teaching us all that education isn't about buildings or budgets. It's about one person caring enough to pass on knowledge to someone who needs it.